Have you ever booked an Airbnb that just didn't feel right? Maybe the atmosphere was off, or you couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching you. Most of the time, it's just your imagination. But sometimes it's not. It was a business trip, nothing out of the ordinary. My company arranged an Airbnb for me in a quiet suburban area of Denver, Colorado, a small, standalone guest house behind a larger home. The pictures looked fine, and the reviews were decent, so I didn't think much of it. But from the moment I arrived, something about the place felt wrong. The floors creaked more than they should have, and the closet door in the bedroom never fully closed. I figured it was just an old house with some quirks. I was 27, traveling alone, and I refused to let my childhood fears creep back into my head. That evening, after a long day of meetings, I decided to unwind by watching a movie. Halfway through, I started hearing soft, crackling sounds from inside the closet. It wasn't loud or frequent, just enough to make me notice. I convinced myself it was just the house settling, turned up the volume, and went back to my movie. By the time it ended, I was exhausted. I took some melatonin, turned off the lights, and settled into bed. Just as I was about to drift off, I heard it again. The same faint crackling noise, now occurring more often. I pulled the blanket over my head and tried to ignore it. Sometime during the night, a different sound woke me up. It was the distinct rustling of fabric. I sat up, barely able to see in the darkness. My pulse quickened as I reached for the bedside lamp and flicked it on. And then I saw him. A man dressed in dark clothing with a hood pulled over his head was standing near the closet, rummaging through my belongings. He had to be at least 6 feet 4 inches, and his presence filled the small room. I froze for a second before instinct kicked in, and I yelled as loud as I could. He spun around, bolted for the door, and disappeared into the night. My wallet and a watch were missing, but the worst part wasn't what he took. It was knowing that he had been in there, possibly watching me sleep. I immediately called the police, my hands unsteady as I tried to explain what had happened. The officer who arrived checked the doors and windows. No signs of forced entry, nothing out of place, except for my stolen items. The host arrived not long after, claiming the locks were brand new and that no one else had access to the property. He even seemed a little annoyed, like he thought I was making it up. But I knew what I saw, and I knew what I heard. When I checked the closet, an uneasy feeling settled over me. There were scratches on the inside of the door, like someone had been gripping the wood too tightly or trying to force it closed from the inside. My thoughts raced. Had he been hiding there before I even arrived? How long had he been in that house with me? I left that Airbnb at dawn, too unsettled to stay any longer. I checked into a hotel instead, double-checking the locks before finally trying to sleep. But every creak, every shadow in the corner of my eye kept me alert. The idea that someone might be there, watching, never left me. The police never caught the guy. Airbnb refunded my stay and offered some support, but I never got a real explanation. The host changed the locks again and continued renting out the property. I checked the listing weeks later. New guests, new reviews. No one else seemed to have an experience like mine. Maybe he was only there that one night. Maybe I was just unlucky. Or maybe he's still finding places to hide. But what really disturbed me was something I hadn't noticed at first. When I checked my phone the next morning, I saw that my camera roll had new photos, photos I didn't take. There were grainy, dark images of me sleeping, taken from inside the closet. The realization made my stomach drop. The man hadn't just been hiding, he had been watching. I took the photos to the police, but they told me there was little they could do. The images weren't clear enough to identify him. The Airbnb host denied having security cameras, and without proof of forced entry, there were no real leads to follow. Weeks passed, but I couldn't shake the paranoia. I kept imagining waking up to find another stranger standing in the corner of my room, silently watching. I started double-locking every door, checking every closet and under every bed before I could sleep. Even then, rest didn't come easily. Months later, I was scrolling through social media when I stumbled upon a post in a local crime forum. Someone had shared a nearly identical story. Different Airbnb, different location, but the same unsettling details. Closet door slightly ajar, strange noises, photos appearing on their phone. The thought unsettled me in a way I couldn't explain. Was this just a coincidence? Or was this something bigger? A pattern? A person who did this again and again? I reported the post to the authorities, but I never got an update. To this day, I don't know if they ever caught him. I don't know if he's still out there, waiting for his next guest. All I know is, I will never stay in an Airbnb again. If you ever book an Airbnb, always check the locks, inspect the room, and trust your instincts. And if something feels off, don't ignore it. I was 27, feeling stuck in a job I didn't care about, and trapped in a relationship that felt more like a responsibility than love. I needed a break, somewhere far from everything and everyone. So I booked a secluded Airbnb cabin in the outskirts of Eureka, Montana. It was cheap, isolated, and surrounded by endless pine forests. The pictures made it look like the perfect getaway, small, rustic, with a beautiful view of the valley below. When I told my parents, they thought it was a good idea. My girlfriend, on the other hand, found it weird. She kept asking why I wanted to be alone in the middle of nowhere. I didn't have an answer. I just knew I needed space. That Friday, I packed my backpack with some clothes, my laptop, and a few essentials. Then got in my car and started the drive from Spokane, Washington. It was supposed to be a 4-hour trip, but the deeper I drove into Montana, the more desolate it became. Eventually, my GPS directed me off the highway and onto an unmarked dirt road. There were no street signs, just dense woods on both sides. According to the host's instructions, I needed to follow the road for 2 miles until I saw a clearing. And there it was, an old wooden cabin sitting alone on a small hill. No neighbors, no signs of life. The moment I stepped out of my car, I felt the sheer quiet of the place. No sounds except for the occasional rustling of trees in the wind. It was peaceful, but also unnerving. The host had left the key under a pile of firewood on the porch. Inside, the place was simple. A cozy living room with a fireplace, a small kitchen, and a ladder leading up to a lofted bedroom. The only window upstairs was a small circular one that overlooked the treetops. It seemed perfect. I spent the afternoon hiking along a nearby trail. On my way back, I noticed 2 men walking down the dirt road. They weren't dressed like hikers, no backpacks, no gear, just old, worn-out clothes. As I drove past them, they stopped walking. They just stood there watching me. I nodded and gave a small wave, expecting them to do the same. But they didn't move. They just stared. Something about their expressions made me uneasy. I forced myself to ignore it and continued driving. When I got back to the cabin, I locked the door behind me and settled in with a book by the fire. The sun was beginning to set when I realized I hadn't bought any food. I decided to head into Libby, Montana, the nearest town, about 40 minutes away. As I backed my car down the hill, I glanced toward the tree line near the entrance of the property, and I saw movement. Two figures darted into the woods. I couldn't tell if it was the same men from earlier, but my gut told me it was. Feeling uneasy, I texted the Airbnb host. His response was quick. The area has a lot of hunters and hikers, nothing to worry about. I wasn't convinced, but I tried to brush it off. After grabbing groceries, I made the long drive back. By the time I arrived, it was pitch black. No lights, no nearby houses, just my car's headlights cutting through the darkness. I parked, grabbed my things, and hurried inside. The first thing I did was lock the door. I made a quick meal and went back to reading. But then, everything shut off. The lights, the heater, even the fridge. The only glow came from the fireplace. Right as I reached for my phone, a message popped up from the host. Check the breaker behind the cabin. Happens sometimes. I stared at the message, my stomach tightening. There was no way I was stepping outside, not after what I saw earlier. And then I heard it, a slow, deliberate creak. It came from the dark corner near the bathroom. I turned my head, and there he was, a figure, tall, motionless, just beyond the firelight. Then in a quiet, steady voice, he spoke. Stay calm. Give me what I want. I was frozen, my throat dry. Somehow I managed to stammer out, I don't have much. Just my laptop, some cash. He didn't move closer, but I could feel the weight of his presence pressing down on me. Wallet, now. With shaking hands, I pulled out the few bills I had and set them on the table. Go to the kitchen, stay there. I didn't argue. I backed away, never taking my eyes off him. A few moments later, I heard the front door open, then close. Silence. I waited before creeping out to check. He was gone. My backpack, my laptop, and my wallet were gone too. I called 911 immediately. It took nearly 40 minutes for a sheriff's deputy to arrive. I described the two men I had seen earlier, convinced it had to be them. But all he could say was, we'll check the area. When I messaged the Airbnb host about what happened, his response was, off. At first, he seemed sympathetic, but when I asked if anyone else had access to the cabin, he avoided the question, and he refused to refund me. I left the next morning, shaken but grateful I wasn't hurt. But something still doesn't sit right with me. How did he get in? Was he already inside when I arrived? And why did the power cut out at the exact moment I felt safe? A part of me will always wonder if the Airbnb host wasn't just aware of what happened, but if he was part of it. A few months ago, my wife Claire and I decided to take a weekend trip with our two boys, Ethan and Jacob. We wanted a break from city life, so we rented an Airbnb in the mountains. It was a cozy wooden cabin surrounded by trees with no other houses nearby. Just peaceful nature. It seemed like the perfect escape. We arrived late in the afternoon. The sun was setting behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the trees. The cabin looked just like the pictures, small but well kept, with a porch swing and a fire pit outside. Inside, there were 2 bedrooms, a tiny kitchen, and a living room with a stone fireplace. It felt warm and welcoming at first. The Airbnb host, Greg, had left a note on the counter. Welcome. Make yourselves at home. Call me if you need anything. I live down the road." That made me feel safe, knowing someone was nearby in case of an emergency. But looking back now, I wish we had never stayed there. After unpacking, the kids wanted to explore. Jacob, my oldest, was excited about the woods, but Ethan, my youngest, kept staring toward the trees behind the cabin. "There's a boy over there," Ethan said. I followed his gaze but saw nothing, just tall trees swaying in the wind. "A boy?" I asked. "Where?" Ethan pointed. "Right there, he's waving." Claire and I exchanged looks. There was no one there. I figured Ethan was just imagining things. Kids do that all the time. Jacob rolled his eyes. "There's no one there, dummy." Ethan frowned. "Yes, there is." I didn't want to encourage the idea, so I just told them to stay close to the cabin. Then we went inside to make dinner. After dinner, we sat around the fire pit, roasting marshmallows. The night was quiet except for the occasional rustling in the trees. At around 10 p.m., we put the kids to bed. Claire and I stayed up a little longer, enjoying the peace and quiet. But as we sat in the living room, I started to feel uneasy. I didn't know why. Then we heard it. Footsteps, soft but steady, moving around the porch. Claire's eyes widened. "Did you hear that?" I nodded and got up, walking toward the front door. I flipped on the porch light and looked outside. Nothing. The porch was empty. I stepped outside, scanning the trees. There was no movement, no sound, just stillness. Maybe it was an animal, I told myself. Or maybe I was just on edge because of what Ethan said earlier. I locked the door and went to bed, trying to shake off the feeling that someone had been there. After dinner, we sat around the fire pit, roasting marshmallows. The night was quiet, except for the occasional rustling in the trees. At around 10 p.m., we put the kids to bed. Claire and I stayed up a little longer, enjoying the peace and quiet. But as we sat in the living room, I started to feel uneasy. I didn't know why. Then we heard it. Footsteps, soft but steady, moving around the porch. Claire's eyes widened. "Did you hear that?" I nodded and got up, walking toward the front door. I flipped on the porch light and looked outside. Nothing. The porch was empty. I stepped outside, scanning the trees. There was no movement, no sound, just stillness. Maybe it was an animal, I told myself. Or maybe I was just on edge because of what Ethan said earlier. I locked the door and went to bed, trying to shake off the feeling that someone had been there. After dinner, we sat around the fire pit, roasting marshmallows. The night was quiet except for the occasional rustling in the trees. At around 10 p.m., we put the kids to bed. Claire and I stayed up a little longer, enjoying the peace and quiet. But as we sat in the living room, I started to feel uneasy. I didn't know why. Then we heard it. Footsteps, soft but steady, moving around the porch. Claire's eyes widened. "Did you hear that?" I nodded and got up, walking toward the front door. I flipped on the porch light and looked outside. Nothing. The porch was empty. I stepped outside, scanning the trees. There was no movement, no sound, just stillness. Maybe it was an animal, I told myself. Or maybe I was just on edge because of what Ethan said earlier. I locked the door and went to bed, trying to shake off the feeling that someone had been there. As we drove away, Ethan looked out the window. He smiled and waved. I glanced in the rearview mirror, my heart pounding. I didn't see anything, but Ethan whispered, "Bye, Lucas." I don't know what my son saw. I don't know if it was just his imagination or something else. But I do know one thing. Something was waiting for him that night, And if I hadn't woken up in time, he might have gone with it.